It was a crime that shook South Memphis to its core, a 7-year-old girl caught in the crossfire of her parents' endless war. A tragic tale of love turned to hate, of cycles of violence that no one ever stopped. The kind of story that forces an entire community to ask itself, how did we let this happen? A home is supposed to be a place of warmth, of safety. A mother's arms should be a shield, a father's presence a source of strength. But what happens when that home becomes a battlefield? When the man meant to protect becomes the one to fear? How does love curdle into something so dark, so violent, that even a child isn't spared? This is the story of Maliyah Kincaid, a little girl whose life was stolen by the very hands that once held her. A story of a mother trapped in fear, a father consumed by rage, and a system that looked the other way until it was too late. Before we dive into this devastating case, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more chilling true crime stories that expose the darkest corners of the human soul. Tamara Kincaid and Dorian Wallace were never meant to be a love story. They were a ticking time bomb, two volatile souls drawn together not by passion, not by love, but by chaos. Their relationship was an endless cycle of screaming matches, shattered glass, and bruises that never had time to fade before fresh ones took their place. They were the kind of couple that made neighbors lower their blinds and turn up their TVs. The kind that made police officers roll their eyes when yet another domestic disturbance call came in, knowing that by the time they arrived, Tamara would have already changed her story, and Dorian would be standing at the door with that same smug look, knowing he wouldn't spend more than a few hours in a holding cell. Tamara, at 29, had nothing to her name but regrets and an alcohol dependency she refused to call a problem. She had spent her childhood in a house where love was a transaction, given only when earned, and taken away without warning. Her mother, sharp-tongued and mean, had cycled through boyfriends like clockwork, men who came and went, some who hit, some who just watched while her mother did the hitting. Tamara had learned early that love and pain were the same thing. By the time she met Dorian, she was already numb to the kind of love that left marks. She had been a high school dropout, bouncing from couch to couch, her dreams swallowed by survival. Dorian was 3 years older, rough around the edges, and the type of man her mother would have called a mistake waiting to happen. He had spent most of his early 20s selling dime bags on Memphis street corners, his reputation built on a mix of charm and intimidation. He wasn't a kingpin, not even close, but he knew how to make quick money, and he knew how to make people listen. When Dorian decided to go legit, it wasn't because he wanted a better life, it was because he was tired of looking over his shoulder. He got a job at a tire shop, tried to clean up his act, but the rage inside him had nowhere to go. He had been raised in a world where men didn't talk about their feelings, they drank them away, beat them out, buried them deep. And when Tamara came into his life, it was like pouring gasoline onto a fire that was already burning out of control. Their fights were legendary. They broke furniture, punched holes in walls, screamed loud enough for the entire block to hear. And yet, they always found their way back to each other. The cops would come, take statements, maybe drag Dorian off in handcuffs for the night, but by the next day, Tamara would be posting his bail, waiting for him outside with a cigarette and a weak excuse about how it wasn't his fault. Then came Maliyah. Tamara had never wanted to be a mother. She hadn't even known she was pregnant until it was too late to do anything about it. When Maliyah was born, she felt nothing. No instant bond, no overwhelming love. Just exhaustion, resentment, and a screaming baby she had no idea how to care for. Dorian wasn't much better. He wasn't the type to hold his daughter in his arms and whisper soft words. He barely even looked at her in the beginning. Maliyah was just another responsibility, another mouth to feed, another thing to stress over when the rent was due, and the fridge was empty. But Maliyah was there. She was there when her mother drank herself into oblivion, stumbling around the apartment, muttering curses at the world. She was there when her father stormed through the door, his fists clenched, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger. She was there when the fights broke out, when the walls rattled with the force of their rage, when the apologies that followed felt as hollow as the silence in their wake. Maliyah learned early how to disappear. She learned that when her parents fought, the best thing she could do was make herself small, hide in the corner of her tiny bedroom with her tattered teddy bear and pretend she was somewhere else. She knew better than to cry out, knew better than to beg them to stop. They never listened. She was a quiet child, her brown eyes always wary, always watching. At school, she barely spoke. Her teachers noticed the bruises, small ones, on her arms, her legs, but Tamara always had an excuse. "She's clumsy," she'd say with a forced laugh. "Always falling down." And just like that, the questions stopped. No one ever looked closer. No one ever asked why a 7-year-old flinched when a voice was raised. No one ever wondered why she seemed so much smaller than she really was. But Maliyah was there. And on the night of July 23rd, when her parents' latest fight turned into something worse than she had ever seen, she had nowhere left to hide. The walls of the apartment had heard 1,000 fights before, but tonight, they absorbed something far worse. The air inside reeked of sweat, alcohol, and the metallic scent of rage. Tamara's voice was slurred, her accusations like jagged knives slicing through the tense silence between them. "You think I didn't see you?" She spat, stumbling against the kitchen counter. "Laughing all up in Kendra's face, like I'm fucking stupid?" Dorian rolled his eyes, his patience already worn thin. "You're drunk, Tamara. Go sleep that shit off." The words were dismissive, a spark to gasoline. Tamara lunged at him, her nails raking across his forearm. "I ain't drunk, you disrespectful motherfucker," she shrieked. Dorian shoved her back, sending her staggering into the dining table. The wooden chair scraped against the floor as she caught herself, her breath heaving, her face twisted with fury. "Keep your fucking hands to yourself," he warned. But Tamara had never been one to back down. She grabbed the closest thing within reach, a half-empty bottle of Hennessy, and hurled it at him. It missed. Glass exploded against the wall, amber liquid dripping down like blood. That was the last thing she remembered before the bat came down. The metal connected with the side of her head with a sickening crack. The force of it sent her sprawling onto the floor, her body twitching, fingers curling in reflex. Blood pooled fast, warm and thick, seeping into the cracks of the linoleum. Maliyah's scream cut through the air. Dorian turned, the bat still clutched in his trembling hands. His daughter was in the doorway, her tiny frame shaking, her hands clasped over her mouth in horror. Her big brown eyes, those same eyes that had once looked up at him with admiration, were now wide with terror. "Shut the fuck up, Maliyah." But she couldn't. Her sobs ripped through the room, high-pitched and desperate. Dorian's head throbbed. The room spun. The sound of her cries was a hammer to his skull, pounding, pounding, pounding. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. His fingers flexed around the bat. And then, he swung. The first blow sent Maliyah flying back against the wall. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, a sharp gasp escaping before her body crumpled to the floor. The second strike caved in her tiny ribs. The snap of breaking bone was loud, too loud. The third cracked her skull wide open. Blood spattered across the walls, the floor, the teddy bear she had clutched so tightly. Her body twitched once, twice, then nothing. Silence. A silence so thick, so final, that for a moment, even Dorian couldn't breathe. He let the bat slip from his fingers, the clang of metal against tile echoing in the room. His hands, his shirt, his face, everything was soaked in blood. Tamara's. Maliyah's. And as he stood over their broken bodies, the weight of what he had done crashed down on him like 1,000 pounds of stone. The night was heavy with silence when the neighbors finally decided to call the police. They had heard it all before, the screaming, the cursing, the crashes of furniture being thrown. But something about tonight was different. The fight had escalated too quickly. The yelling had stopped too suddenly. And then, nothing. The patrol car pulled up in front of the apartment just past midnight. Officers Henry Lawson and Marcus Griggs were the first to arrive. They had been to this address before, had spoken to both Tamara and Dorian about their never-ending cycle of violence. Usually, it was the same routine, Tamara with a busted lip, Dorian with scratches down his arms, both refusing to press charges. But when Officer Griggs knocked on the door, there was no answer. Just a faint, eerie creak as the wind rattled the screen door. Then, a sound. A low, broken mumble from inside. Lawson exchanged a look with his partner before reaching for the door handle. It was unlocked. The stench of blood hit them first. It was thick, metallic, clinging to the air like smoke. The dim overhead light flickered, casting shadows on the walls. And there, in the middle of the living room, sat Dorian Wallace. His clothes were soaked in deep crimson, his hands trembling as he rocked back and forth, whispering under his breath. His pupils were blown wide, his breathing shallow, as if his own body was struggling to comprehend what had just happened. "I didn't mean to," he muttered. "I didn't mean to." Lawson's stomach tightened as he followed the trail of blood leading into the next room. The sight would haunt him forever. Tamara lay on the floor, barely breathing, a deep gash across her forehead where the bat had connected. Blood had pooled around her head, soaking into her once blonde braids. Her chest rose and fell in weak, uneven gasps. But it was what was next to her that made Lawson stagger back. Maliyah. Her tiny frame twisted unnaturally, her skull split open, her once brown eyes frozen in a stare that would never blink again. Her small hands, covered in dried blood, still clutched her teddy bear, the same bear she had dragged around everywhere since she was 3. The officers stood frozen for a moment, absorbing the horror of the scene. And then, instinct kicked in. "Get paramedics here now." Griggs barked into his radio. Lawson grabbed Dorian by the arm. "What the hell did you do?" Dorian didn't resist. He didn't fight. He just kept whispering. "I didn't mean to." By the time backup arrived, the scene was a blur of flashing lights, police tape, and crime scene photographers capturing every inch of the carnage. Neighbors stood outside in stunned silence, some shaking their heads, others clutching their chests in disbelief. This wasn't just another domestic dispute. This was a massacre. Dorian Wallace was cuffed and shoved into the back of a police car, charged on the spot with first-degree murder for Maliyah and aggravated assault for Tamara. Tamara was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. She spent 3 weeks there, recovering from skull fractures and internal bleeding. But when she woke up, the law was waiting. Because while Dorian had swung the bat, Tamara had also failed Maliyah. She had kept her child in a war zone. Ignored the warning signs. Chose violence over safety, again and again. And now, Maliyah was dead. Tamara Kincaid was charged with child endangerment and accessory to murder. The outrage spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with debates. News stations aired footage of the blood-stained apartment, the crime scene tape fluttering in the summer breeze. Commentators dissected every red flag, every missed opportunity to save that little girl. Because the truth was, everyone had seen this coming. The teachers who noticed Maliyah's bruises but never pushed too hard for answers. The neighbors who heard the fights but figured it wasn't their business. The family members who shrugged and said, "That's just how they are." Everyone knew. And yet, no one had done a damn thing. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The wooden benches were filled to capacity, journalists scribbling notes, family members of both the victim and the accused sitting in rigid silence, and members of the community who had followed the case with a mix of anger and sorrow. The trial of Dorian Wallace and Tamara Kincaid had captured South Memphis in a way few cases ever had. It wasn't just about one brutal night, it was about everything that led up to it. The years of violence. The warnings ignored. The system that had failed to protect a 7-year-old girl from the people who were supposed to love her the most. Dorian sat at the defense table, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, his wrists bound in cuffs. His once proud demeanor was gone. He looked hollowed out, his eyes sunken, his lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. Across the room, Tamara sat at a separate table, her hands shaking as she gripped a tissue in her lap. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted Dorian as a monster, a man who had terrorized both his girlfriend and his child for years before finally taking the ultimate step. They played the 911 call, the sound of Tamara's gasping breaths and Dorian's frantic murmuring echoing through the courtroom. They showed crime scene photos, Maliyah's broken body, the blood-stained walls, the metal baseball bat that had been turned into a murder weapon. This was no accident, the prosecutor told the jury. This was the final act of a man who used fear as a weapon, and when that wasn't enough, he used his hands. His fists. His rage. The defense tried to push a different narrative. Dorian's lawyer argued that he had snapped. That years of a toxic, violent relationship had pushed him over the edge. That he hadn't meant to kill his daughter, he had only reacted in the heat of the moment. They brought up Tamara's role in the chaos, how she had also contributed to the environment of abuse, how she had even provoked the fight that led to that night. They painted a picture of a man who had been broken by his own past, raised in a home where violence was the only language spoken, trapped in a cycle he didn't know how to escape. But none of it mattered. Because no excuse could change what had happened to Maliyah. The jury sat in silence as the autopsy report was read aloud. As the medical examiner described the force of the blows that had shattered her tiny ribs, caved in her skull, and left her unrecognizable. It took them less than 3 hours to come back with a verdict. Guilty. On all counts. Dorian Wallace was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read, he didn't flinch. He only lowered his head, his shoulders rising and falling with a single, shuddering breath. Tamara, who had taken a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Dorian, received 12 years in prison for child endangerment and accessory to murder. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she turned toward the gallery, her tear-filled eyes locking onto the faces of her own family, people who had begged her, time and time again, to leave Dorian before it was too late. It was too late. Maliyah was gone. No verdict, no sentence, no legal decision could change that. The courtroom emptied out slowly, people shaking their heads, wiping tears, murmuring about how they had always seen this coming. And yet, none of them had done a damn thing to stop it. The city of Memphis carried a heavy silence in the weeks after the trial. Murals of Maliyah Kincaid appeared on street corners, painted by artists who never met her but felt the weight of her loss. Candlelight vigils flickered outside her elementary school, stuffed animals and flowers piling up at the gates. The news cycle had moved on, but the people who knew her, teachers, neighbors, the social workers who had knocked on her door but never intervened, could not. Inside the South Memphis church hall, voices rose and fell as the community gathered, not for protest, but for reflection. The guilt, the shame, the frustration, it hung in the air like smoke. "We let that little girl down," an elderly woman murmured, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. Across the room, a man cleared his throat. How many times we see this happening? How many times we hear a woman screaming and tell ourselves, it ain't our business. His voice wavered. And now a child is gone. The weight of the truth sat on everyone's shoulders. Maliyah's story wasn't new. There had been others before her, and there would be others after. It was the kind of tragedy that repeated itself in households across the country, different names, same outcome. A mother who thought love could fix a man. A father who mistook control for power. A child caught in the crossfire. The prison walls held Dorian Wallace now, but his name was still spoken in low, bitter tones. His mugshot had become a symbol, of rage, of lost potential, of everything people in the neighborhood had learned to fear. He was the boy who had grown into the man they had all seen coming. He had been in fights before he was a teenager. He had been arrested before he was a man. He had always carried violence like a second skin, and when he killed his daughter, nobody was truly shocked. But there was no satisfaction in his downfall. No one celebrated his conviction, because his existence was a reminder of something bigger. How many boys like him were still out there, being raised on the same streets, learning the same habits, walking the same path? Would they ever change? Would anyone step in before it was too late? And then there was Tamara. Some people pitied her. Others spat at the mention of her name. She had cried in court, her face buried in trembling hands, but the world had little sympathy. She failed her baby, someone said at the community meeting. I don't care what that man did to her, she stayed. She let that little girl live in that house, knowing damn well what was gonna happen. But she was a victim, too, another voice argued. Y'all talk like leaving is easy. That man had his claws in her. You think she didn't want to run? Then why didn't she? The arguments went in circles. Victim or coward? A woman trapped, or a mother too afraid to fight back? Either way, Maliyah was still dead. And Tamara would have to live with that until the day she died. Maliyah's funeral was a closed casket. The damage to her small body had been too much for even the best morticians to fix. The people who came to say goodbye did not see her face, only a white coffin small enough to remind everyone just how young she was. Somewhere in a prison cell, Dorian sat alone. Somewhere in another prison cell, Tamara did the same. The world had moved on. But the people of South Memphis knew better. There would be another Maliyah. Another Tamara. Another Dorian. And the cycle undid her. Her home was not a sanctuary. It was a war zone, and she was its smallest, most helpless casualty. The signs were always there. The screams, the bruises. The whispers in the neighborhood about the fights, the police calls, the apologies that meant nothing. And yet, no one acted. No one saved her. Not the neighbors who heard the chaos through the walls. Not the family members who looked the other way. Not the system that failed to intervene before it was too late. Maliyah's death forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many children are living in homes just like hers, waiting for the day their luck runs out? How many parents stay in toxic relationships, convincing themselves that as long as the abuse isn't directed at their child, they're safe? How many times will we hear stories like this before real change happens? Dorian Wallace will spend the rest of his life in a prison cell. Tamara Kincaid will serve her time, carrying the weight of her choices. But justice, if it can even be called that, will not bring Maliyah back. It will not erase the horrors she endured in her short life. It will not stop another child from becoming the next headline. The cycle continues. The only question is, who will stop it? If this story shook you, if it made you think twice, don't let it end here. Share this story. Speak up. And if you ever hear a child's cry for help, don't ignore it. You may be their only chance.